So today we're going to talk about the school-based services. Now, when I talk about school-based services, I'm talking about a pediatric learning guide is children go to school the day they are born. Isn't that funny? They are learning all sorts of stuff that first 6 weeks. They are in that school of development. You know, they're rolling, they're figuring out the world, they're going from this little itty bitty place to like a very large place with lots of people who talk and lots of noise. So they do have a lot of growing up to do and a lot of learning to do. I would say in birth to 6 weeks, kids really need that tummy time. I'm telling you, from the day they come out, they should be doing tummy time on your chest, 1 to 2, 3 minutes a day, getting used to being in that position. If your child has difficulties and you're concerned, I want you to keep a log, but also contact your pediatrician. That way you'll have some sort of information written down so that you aren't having to try to remember when you're not getting a lot of sleep and all of those other things. When they're 6 weeks to 3 years old, they are either home with a parent, a nanny, daycare, preschool, early intervention, or clinical services. So if your child is having difficulties from birth to 3, the person responsible is that early intervention team, okay? Those early intervention services, speech, OT, PT, other school-based services, they will come to your home and they will work with your child on those areas of difficulty. When you get to that 3-year age, that's when the school department takes over. Around 2 years, 10 months, they will start their evaluations. And then at that time, you can be home with a parent, you can be with the nanny, you can go to daycare, preschool, early intervention, and clinical services, okay? So when you're looking at those times, that 6 weeks to 3 years old, that 3 years old to 6 years old, you have a lot of options for people to help you. When you get down and you start that 6+, when you're in that school-based service, you don't have as many options. So you want to do as much as you can from birth to 6. That way you have control over almost everything, okay? When you're born, you can have clinical services, so like occupational therapy or speech therapy right from the get-go. We start kids as early as 2 months in our clinic. We find that they make a lot of progress, and it's just those parents who are really paying attention to those cues. Maybe they had a child that it was their second child and they're noticing things. Maybe it's their first child, but their friends are giving them a couple of different kinds of looks. It's really important to try to remain calm, but also just objective in seeing what your child's doing compared to other children. Now, we don't want to go in and start comparing and have this big competitive mess, but we do want to be realistic with ourselves and get help as early as possible. We have this tummy time icon up here. It's one of the first activities that children do that is purposeful, and it creates such a diverse understanding for them. They're learning how to feel the ground with the front of them. They're moving their head. They're building up the muscles in the back of that head, the back of that neck. Those are muscles that do not get built up unless you're doing that tummy time. We see a lot of kids with difficulty moving their heads. They have flatter heads on the back because they haven't been doing that tummy time. Even kids through teenage years should be on their stomachs. A lot of them are crouched over looking at those iPads, those iPhones, computers. We really want to get them on their stomachs. Still, when you're in that teenage years, building up the back of that head, the neck, the back of the back, those are very important skills and muscles to be developed for reading, writing, math, sports, making friends. So really, it's very important. It's very important. Okay? As parents, we have a lot of responsibility. Okay? We have these children. We feel like when we hand them over to daycare or the schools, we are released of that responsibility. In some way we are, because a lot of times we're paying for our children to be taken care of by someone else, but we are really responsible for their sleep, their nutrition, what happens before they go there, what happens after. the state that you hand them over to someone else. Sleep. Typically, birth through 18 years old, you should be getting 9 to 12 hours of sleep. So if you're not, you should be able to switch your bedtimes to earlier in the night for kids that are even in middle school. My middle schoolers are always complaining that, we're going to bed too early. Everyone else goes to bed later. But the fact of the matter is we're waking you up at 6:30. So if you're having to wake your child up, you know that you're putting them to bed at the right time because they are still sleeping, okay? If they're having difficulty sleeping, my son did not sleep through the night till he was 7, and that was no fun for me, but he required a lot of sensory input to calm down, to go to sleep. We tried different things along the way. I would say, talk to your pediatrician if you're having abnormal sleeping issues. Use music, use weighted blankets, use the oils, use projectors. You really want to have them calm down about 30 to 60 minutes before bedtime. So we're getting off that tablet, we're getting off those things, we're calming things down, we're playing some Legos, we're playing with our parents, we're reading books. You want to have a robust bedtime routine. I always joke with my husband because he is the bedtime guy, thank God. And he has this routine, and he just is able to do it from the day they were born until now. We're at 11 and 13, and he's still going strong. He's got the timer. He does it all. So really, that timer does help. Even though I laugh at him, it's a well-oiled machine. He does not have to tell them twice. They're just used to doing it. It's a very easy process for him. Okay, so before school, so it's your responsibility to prime your child for school, daycare, nanny, things like that, Always use those visuals. We gave you guys a lot of visuals to use over the last 2 courses, and those are things you can be using for right now. So for instance, if you're having trouble getting ready in the morning, you can use that behavior chart to have it get ready in the morning, be what they're earning. So maybe they're getting a circle or a check mark for every single task that they do in the morning. When they're done with that task, maybe you're giving them that 5 minutes of technology. Typically, we like to do those exercises, those sensory strategies, those proprioceptive input. The most important thing is those sit-ups. Do I want a 2-year-old to do sit-ups? Yes, I want a 2-year-old to do sit-ups. I want to hold their feet, I want to hold their hands, and I want to slowly help them pull up. You may see this neck drag. That's showing you they do not have the neck strength that they should have at that age. So you continually should be doing that. The breakfast. It's really important to have a breakfast with high protein, some fat, and low sugar. So when I was going through a class, they were like, the best breakfast is chicken and a piece of it, and an apple. So a chicken breast and an apple. If you think about it that way, you're getting all of everything you need in those 2 foods. So there's a bunch of foods on here that there's kind of examples, but even if you have to get chocolate milk, whole milk, you're getting the protein, you're getting the fat, you're getting a little bit of sugar, You want to talk to them before they leave the house. You want to create this calm environment so they're not leaving in this big chaotic disaster. The way you get to that point is doing the same routine over and over and over, You want to say to them, if we're working on sitting and paying attention at school, that's what you discuss. You say, what are the things that we're working on when we go to school today? We're working on keeping our hands to ourselves. Show me what it looks like to keep your hands to yourself. I usually do this. Have them practice these things a couple times before they get on the bus. That way you know you've sent them to school with everything that you possibly have, I gave you a little checklist. So I utilized this checklist for anything, for morning, for afternoon, but brush your teeth, have your breakfast. They can check those things off. Utilize visuals for all of your areas of activity. Even though it's a little bit more as the setup, it will increase their ability to do things independently, okay? There are some things that are in control. I know sending your kids off to school feels like there's a lot of those out of control moments where you're like, I have no control over this. I don't get a lot of feedback from the teacher. I'm really wanting more to get my hands in there a little more. So things that I do and things that I've suggested to others is add ice to their water bottle, okay? Freezing cold water will self-regulate. It will either wake them up if they're understimulated, or if they're sensory seeking, it will give them a lot of input at once. The mouth, the face, and the jaw are full of sensory receptors. So if you have a straw, you're sucking through that straw, you're getting that proprioceptive input that they're looking for. So you're giving them a tool that they can utilize throughout that day, okay? Another thing for the water bottle is if you have a child with like ADHD or who needs to get up and have those movement breaks, don't fill up the water bottle. They have filling stations in the middle of the hallways at school. Allow your child to have to get up for those types of activities, so you're creating them to have a movement break so that they have something to do, because they can't always ask to go to the bathroom. The teacher catches on to that. So you want to create opportunities for them to be able to get up. Oh, can you give this note to your teacher? That's an opportunity to get up, okay? Sometimes I add a note or tell people to add a note into their lunch. Hi, could be like, I love you, things like that, but also remember, keeping your hands to yourself, making good choices. That way you can have those reminders in their lunchbox. They can see those, and that can reframe them for the rest of the day. Adding visual checklists to the backpack. On our next slide, there'll be pictures. I created these little, they're like little squares you just put on with a ring on your backpack, and whatever you want them to remember. It can be things like, keeping your hands to yourself, things like that. So every time they go to the backpack to get something, they see that visual. For my son, he left a lot of materials at school, so we created this one for them. These are the things he needed to bring home and that needed to come home every day, so he had that on his backpack. Definitely nonchalant, and it gives a lot of punch because it's really impactful for them to see that visual. The other ones, I do those AM and PM, so like before school and after school, those were my checklists. Having those visuals again is really gonna get your household organized. Okay, tips and tricks. This is one of my favorite parts because us OTs, we love tips and tricks. So if you want your child to have a better grasp on the pencil, okay, they're usually, holding like this or all these funky ways. I want you to break the crayon into literally 1/2 of an inch. It's a very small amount, so they can only hold on with 3 fingers. 1, you won't have to keep telling them that to fix their grasp. 2, they will be increasing finger strength and dexterity the entire time they're coloring. If you have a child who likes to just scissor right through that paper and it just cuts so fast, he's almost cutting things in his way, thicken that paper. Take flashcards and glue them together, creating a difficult situation to cut through. It's giving the body proprioceptive input, and it's slowing them down so they can focus and stay on the line. If your child is having difficulty coloring within the lines, okay, I want you to draw a picture of a circle or whatever other shapes you're working on in a colored marker. You're gonna line that with glue, and then tomorrow morning, you're gonna have the perfect circle to color in. They're gonna get that kinesthetic feeling when they get to that bump. When they're getting out of those lines, they get that kinesthetic input to say, you are going out of the line. So someone with difficulties paying attention, in a rush all of the time, they will get that indication from the paper versus from you. Like I said in the other trainings, you want to take the information away from you and you want to put it onto something else like those visuals, because then they're getting information from the work that they're doing versus always a constant parent prompt. A lot of times kids have a difficulty with that visual field, So raising up where they're sitting to have a 3-ring binder so that it's a slanted surface. We use things called slant boards. They look like this. They can be wooden as well, but you can use a 3-ring binder. But this gets the paperwork at a 45-degree angle, and what that does is give them a better visual field to like be able to pay attention to understand the information that they're looking at. Use Velcro on the bottom of or the inside of your desk for the fidget. You know, just putting any of that under there, they can pick at it, they can do those types of things. It's really important for them to have something to utilize when they need to have a multi-sensory approach. Kids typically have to need a lot of input to pay attention, okay? So what does that mean? Doing homework with the TV on helps some people, pay attention better and focus on their work because there's a lot of other things going on. Things like the tea stool. So this is a tea stool. They have these in schools a lot. This is going to give you that multisensory approach. So when you're sitting on this, your body needs to all be paying attention or it'll start wobbling around. So this is giving me a multisensory approach so that I can pay attention. The brain has to do many tasks to keep me sitting on this stool properly, okay? This is my favorite version. And this version is great because if a child is not paying attention, they fall over. So you obviously need to make sure that they're safe behind them. But when you're sitting on this, you really do need to pay attention a lot to your body. So it takes that attention to the body so that your mind can pay attention to what's in front of you. One time I gave one of these to a teacher in a school, and she goes, "This is the ADHD miracle." I said, "I know. It's exactly what I like to work on when I'm doing my OT and when I'm doing my paperwork." You can also use like TheraBand at the bottom of the chair. So you can get TheraBand at any, PT place, on Amazon, things like that. And you just tie it around the bottom and they can put their feet, this is a little tall for me, but they can put their feet in them, they can bang them on them, they can have like a lot of fun with that down there, okay? So it's a really great thing to have. You can hand it to the teacher and say, "I really just like TheraBand at the bottom of their chair." These are things that you can ask for your child at school to make their life easier, to make them a better student. You can also take you see a lot of these little cushions on the chairs. They're not as impactful as the tea stools, but they do work for some vestibular input. So to get a really inexpensive one, especially for at home homework, you take a beach ball from the dollar store, you just blow it up a tiny bit, and you have them sit on that. We also use weighted lap pads when we're working with kids. Also different kinds of flexible seating. Maybe they stand while they're doing their homework or eating dinner at the table. Maybe that's better for them. There's a lot of different ways to do it. I think that it's important to drop all the stigmas of it doesn't matter if you're sitting at the table perfectly to eat, do your homework, and other things like that. Some of our kids, we actually have them wear compression clothing under their actual clothes. Compression gives you that input. So basically like buying a rash guard really tight, and they wear it underneath their clothes to give them that sensory input that they're safe and that they're feeling okay so that they can learn, okay? This next slide is one of my favorite slides. So it is a triangle of all of the skills, not all of them because there's many more, but all of the skills that you need to reading, writing, and math, okay? If you're looking at the top, the academics and learning, look at all of the things underneath that you need to do just in the central nervous system, okay? You can create one of these for almost any system, but there's going to be hundreds of things that are underneath that need for the reading, writing, and math. So for instance, if you don't have a good auditory processing and they're just giving you verbal directions, you're not going to know what's going on. That's why we need everyone to be doing that multisensory approach. So you're looking at a lot of visual skills in there. So a lot of things need to be up to par before you can get to the potential of reading, writing, and math that you'd like your child to, or your child can, okay? Vision. So vision is a very large system. It is used for almost every activity unless you're blindfolded. 1 out of 4 children previous to technology, so previous to iPads, previous to phones, 1 out of 4 typically developing children had an ocular motor issue. Ocular motor is the ability to move your eyes, tracking, to be able to look at an object, to be able to go focus shift, look at something and look back, look at something and look back, okay? Visual acuity is 20/20. That's what we go to the eye doctor for, okay? That's that near and far vision, okay? So we're not talking about the need for glasses, although some ocular motor issues do require glasses, but those are more prisms. That's if your eyes are misaligned, okay? So the visual acuity is how they see 20/20. Ocular motor is the ability for the eyes to move in relation to an activity. So you have 4 muscles on your eyes, okay? So we look at the eyes, we look at the ability for them to line up. We look at the ability for them to move, follow something. Fixation, okay? Fixation is just able to maintain a gaze on a stuffed animal, anything that's exciting right in front of you. We call it a look away when you move your eyes over, but you can blink. So a child of the age of 3 should be able to do 3 seconds. A child of the age of 8 should be able to do 20 seconds, okay? So 10 seconds is 5-year-old. So basically you're putting an object in front of their face and you're saying, okay, you need to look at this object. I'm going to time you to see how many seconds you can do. You can blink, but you don't want you to look away, okay? Because what it is the ability for those muscles to stabilize the eye on an object, okay? So when they can do this, they are able to look at the teacher for long periods of time. They're able to look at the book, okay? Kids are getting out of the way of doing this because they're on those iPads, they're on that, on those phones. Things are fast. We need to get them so that they can fixate on something so that they can pay attention in school for their teachers. Tracking is the ability to following a moving object in all planes. 16 inches from the face, you're going to move that very slowly, but you want to make sure that you see them tracking in all planes. They should be able to do this for 1 minute at age 8, okay? 30 seconds at age 5. There should be no problem tracking even when they're a little baby. You should see their ability to track without moving their head or their body. Saccadic movement. Saccadic movement is the eye's ability to jump from one item to the next. It is the most important skill that is for reading, okay? Going from one word to the other. What we look for is overshooting or undershooting. So those eyes may look over that way, but then have to come back. Okay, they might almost get there, but they don't get there, so they have to adjust themselves. So it takes them longer to read because the eyes aren't smoothly completing saccadic movement. Convergence and eye teaming, basically utilizing your eyes at the same time together. Okay, so the eyes are alignment. So you're looking at the eyes to see if they're in the center and they are both aligned. When you're doing eye teaming, it's like when you bring your finger all the way in, your eyes come together and they come apart. A lot of times you'll see one eye come in and maybe the other eye only comes in a little bit. Okay, these are muscles, just like your bicep. You have to work out your eyes just like you have to work out any other part of your body, especially today because of the technology. Their eyes aren't moving in that peripheral, in those peripheral areas. So we really need to facilitate that. And maybe your kid is on technology for an hour and you say, okay, time to get off and do our eye exercises. Maybe you give those eyes an exercise when they get off that technology to make sure that they can do that skill, and then they can, if they have a little bit more time, they can get back on. But really utilizing maybe 1 minute before or after to do those eye exercises so that you're maintaining that eye function. The last part of this is that endurance. A lot of kids can do it, but they get tired. You'll see them rubbing their eyes. They don't like reading. Maybe they read really well for the first minute or two, but then start losing that comprehension, things like that, or they say, oh, I don't want to do any more reading, or they fall asleep. A lot of times kids fall asleep when their eyes need to work out more, basically, and have better endurance. So the symptoms that you would see are like covers or closes one eye or turns head. So like a lot of times we'll see kids in the schools that kind of like put their hand a little bit over their head while they're reading. It's their way of shutting their eye off, okay? When you get really close to a paper, your brain will shut off one eye so that only one eye works. Because if both of them try to work at the same time, you're going to get double vision, okay? So it's really important just to kind of check out and see how your child's eyes are doing. If they rub their eyes, complain of eye strain, they get watery, red, headaches, difficulty in PE with ball skills, holds things close, squints, moves to the front to see things, they're not necessarily acuity. They may be that ocular motor. Difficulty lining up math facts. You see those kids with it's all over the place. Once it gets to 3 digits, addition or multiplication, things like that, they really need to be able to line those up. So we utilize different kinds of adapted paper, grids, things like that, just to get them to make sure that they're lining those up. They have the ability to do the math. They just don't have the ability to have their eyes line up the numbers. So if you don't line up the numbers, the answer is not going to be correct. Difficulty organizing materials in the desk or backpack. Difficulty finding things. Difficulty with like handwriting, line orientation, spacing. Difficulty like copying from a near or far point. Near point is right next to you. So if you say, oh, here, copy from my paper or copy from your computer, that's a near point copy. A far point copy is when they say, okay, copy this off the board, and you have to look back and forth, back and forth. So you better hope that your eyes have that accuracy and are able to, complete those activities with that endurance. Okay, so motor skills for school success. There's a lot of skills that were underneath that academic learning that we need to make sure that are taken care of, okay? Bilateral coordination, using both of those sides of your body together. Now, when we talked about tummy time, you're utilizing bilateral coordination. So from day one, when you're born, you start this process, okay? Crossing that midline. Inability to cross that midline, like we talked about last time, there's the two sides of your brain. They have to have a bridge in between, and they have to have conversations so that the cognitive skills come together and they were able to do the reading, writing, and math. Fine motor skills, strength, dexterity, affects handwriting, and affects independence, being able to do button, zipper, snap. Do you need help with, your backpack, things like that at school? Gross motor skills, issues with strength, posture, poor endurance, PE, sports, recess. You want your kids to enjoy these things. You want to get them to the point where they're at least able to do the skills. So if your child is having difficulty in PE, you should email or call the PE teacher and say, okay, could you give me the schedule of what sports you're going to do when? Because if you know that you have a child that has difficulty with those motor skills, you should be practicing those skills at home before they go so that they can feel confident when they're there. The last area that I'm talking about is executive functioning. This is a very large area, but how we can see it and use it best is the mental skills we use to get things done, to make goals, to organize, to complete tasks, to set goals, to manage time. A lot of those kids are late. Some of them look very lazy. They can look shut down. They can look unmotivated. A lot of times that executive functioning piece is broken, and they can't figure out how to get from A, where they are, to B. So they need things like graphic organizers. They need to different kinds of things. But if you're noticing these things are difficult for your child, this is what you need to let the teacher know. I'm noticing my child has a difficult time organizing things. Are you seeing that with the desk? Because I'm seeing that with the backpack. Is there a way we can do a desk check? Okay, there's a lot of things available to you that you may not know about with schools. You can ask for help for anything your child is having difficulty with, okay? Strategies for school success. We all want our kids to be successful in school. Sometimes it is out of our control, but you really need to be an advocate, especially these days, with your teachers and really help them to understand your child and to help them help your child at school, okay? So the strategies that can be done in school, they can allow your child to access curriculum, create meaningful relationships, such as they have lunch bunch. I bet you didn't even know that. They don't announce these types of things, but if your child is having trouble making friends, the first thing I would do is to call up the teacher and say, hey, what programs at the school do you have that anyone can attend that could help my child learn how to make new friends in a setting that is not going to be where he gets bullied? So they have things called lunch bunch. They have certain children together. They help them make friends with other children. They actually ask, hey, do you want to bring a friend to lunch? So they create these therapeutic opportunities for kids in school, but it's the parents who are asking for those typically, or if there's a very large problem and the teacher needs help, okay? But the teacher doesn't typically tell you they need help till it's very far down. Like I would say you might not hear if there's an issue for a year. And you don't want that. You want to be on top of this stuff, and I know that life kind of gets in the way of things, but if you're noticing something, don't feel bad about emailing the teacher. Reaching out is one of the more important things. Okay, so RTI strategies. So RTI is called response to intervention. These are strategies that have been put in place. There's 3 tiers, okay? Tier 1 is the entire school. This is things like lunch bunch, help with, like checklists, help with things like the sensory processing. All of those things are on tier 1. You are allowed to have those right now. Anytime your child is having trouble, they have tons of strategies they're allowed to give you without any testing or anything. That's RTI 1. RTI 2 is when they say to you, your child is a little below average. We're going to pull them into this specialized reading group for a little while, and they're going to be with 2 or 3 children instead of the whole class getting that instruction. So they're going to be brought into a more small group. And that's not, that's a good thing. They get a smaller group instruction. Tier 3 is a one-on-one pull-out service. You would need to have some sort of testing done or a 504 in place or an IEP for those kinds of tiers, okay? But you do have a lot of options, okay? So what we talked about, T-stools, TheraBand on the chair, footstools, all of those things are available to you, even though you did not know it. The importance of seated posture, okay? So if you're at home for dinner, if you're at home for homework, if they're at school, they should always be able to touch their feet to the ground, okay? You cannot feel safe and stable with your feet dangling. If you go into most classrooms, you see a lot of feet dangling, okay? Kids with typical nervous systems may be able to handle that with typical musculature, but anybody out of that average range, which is most people, honestly, they need that footstool. So we add on things like this, little stools or wooden pieces under their feet so that they can stabilize their feet. That way they can pay attention better. They can have more stabilization when writing, reading, doing math, paying attention to those directions. Okay, slant boards, adapted paper. I put some adapted paper in your folder. There's about 50 kinds of adapted paper. This helps them just visually put the letters or the numbers on the page more easily so that they can do the math. Because a lot of times you're like, okay, my child has trouble with math. What is it? Is it just because they haven't had that small group instruction? Maybe I need a tutor. But I see a lot of people asking for tutors online, and I'm like, why? What are you asking for a tutor for? Okay, my child has trouble in math, but like, what is the problem? You want to get down to the bottom of the issue, you know, check the seating, you know, check different things. Are they lining up those numbers right? Do they have difficulties in some of those areas in that triangle underneath? You know, you really want to figure that out, because if you get a tutor and you have an issue with executive functioning and it's causing you an issue in math, okay? You are band-aiding an issue. You are working on a top-down approach. You are practicing a skill. Practicing a skill, so practicing handwriting is a skill. It's a top-down approach. If you have a difficulty with that ocular motor piece, that ocular motor piece is actually going to affect about 10 things. So instead of working on the top-down approach, which is working on that handwriting or math, working on a bottom-up approach is working on any of those underlying skills that you have difficulty in, okay? So really being conscious as a parent of like, okay, why are they having that difficulty? Not just, okay, we need to get a tutor. Because tutors are great, and it's nice to have that one-on-one attention, but if they don't have the skills to do the actual activity, and I'm not talking about cognitive skills, I mean the skills to like line up the numbers, okay? Then you will be getting help for a lot of other areas at the same time. The next thing is modification versus accommodation. So your child can have modifications and accommodations within that classroom. A lot of them we talked about. Those are RTI strategies, tier 1, whole school strategies, okay? But the modification is like what the curriculum is, okay? How many do we need to answer? So if you need to understand the math, and there's 30 questions, but you have difficulty processing in that short amount of time because your processing may be a little slower than the typical processing speed, then you would do the even numbers. You're still showing that you can do that math. You're getting the confidence because you're finishing your work, and you're also decreasing the amount of work, but it's not affecting the actual ability to learn, okay? Excuse me. When you're looking at accommodations, okay, you're doing things like they can take a break, so having movement breaks. Sometimes teachers will say, okay, why don't you bring this to the office for me? They create helper jobs so that those accommodations can be created to be helper jobs so that they aren't standing out in the class, but they're getting what they need and helping the teacher. So maybe, like I said, you only fill that water bottle halfway. My daughter loves that. She gets to go get some water every couple hours. So, you know, maybe you need a little bit larger print. Maybe you'll need additional time to do that assignment. Maybe you need a little bit of a small group setting, like that tier 2 setting. But these are things that your child is allowed to get, you know, and I think a lot of people don't realize how many accommodations and modifications that you can have without having necessarily testing done or a disability of any kind. These are the most widely used accommodations and modifications. In your packet, I put in there a longer list. The ones that we put in your packet are for the ADHD. Typically, you can have accommodations for anything. If you have allergies, if you have asthma, if you have cancer, if you have any diagnosis, then you are allowed to have accommodations and modifications through what's called a 504. Okay? So when you look through this list, okay, we're looking at all of the things we talked about, like flexible seating, lessened amount of classwork, graphic organizers for creating those longer assignments, visuals, timers. Sometimes, like if your child has a better time, has more difficulty with that vision and needs that auditory, they will have books on like tape, CD. I'm not that old, but I am. So they will have the auditory book while they're reading the regular book at the class level so that they have both the auditory as well as the visual because they still have the book. But they're allowed to have that. That's just something they do on a regular basis. Typing instead of writing. You know, sometimes those longer assignments, if they're having difficulty with handwriting, there's no reason for them to write. They can type. We're going to go over a couple things before Deanna comes out. I want to explain the skills needed for kindergarten, okay? When you're looking at what your responsibility is before kindergarten, I think what you need to understand is that there's a lot of help before kindergarten. The help just gets a little bit less as your child gets older. So utilizing what you can to get help for them when that early intervention point is the most important thing, okay? Don't be afraid to reach out. It's more important to get that reality of what's going on than it is to just avoid it for many years and then it snowballs into something bigger, okay? So things that your kid actually needs for kindergarten: self-advocacy, asking for help, able to use the restroom, wipe, wash hands, put on hand sanitizer, able to sit for meal times, open the containers, use a spoon and fork as necessary. They have to be able to sit on the floor crisscross, okay? We see a lot of those kids doing that W sitting. They're doing that W sitting because they don't have any core strength. So if you get in that position, you realize everything is leaning forward. They're basically hanging on the joints of the knees and the hips instead of using the core stomach, okay? That's giving them that proprioceptive input, and they're able to pay attention, but it's damaging those knees and hips. Able to color within the lines, cut out simple shapes, able to copy simple shapes. They go in the order like this: line down, line across, cross, circle, diagonal both ways, an X, a square, a triangle, and the first name. They should be able to follow 2 to 3 step instructions that are unrelated. Here, can you go take this to the kitchen and then, take this into your bedroom and put it on your bed. Okay, they should be able to do that before they go into kindergarten. Be able to use 4+ word phrases, string beads, nest cups, stacks blocks to 10, completes 10, piece inset puzzle. So these are standard scores. So these are things that your child should be able to do by the age of 5. Don't panic if they're not. A lot of kindergartners do go to school that are not prepared, and if they are typically developing, they'll catch up immediately, okay? It's just really important for you to send your child off to a place where you're like, I feel confident. I feel confident that I gave them the skills necessary to be on their own without me, okay? Some other things: draw a person, trace lines, connect dots, copy a block design, walk up and down the stairs reciprocally. I want you all to leave here and look at how your child goes up and down the stairs. Are they still going down unilaterally? Are they going reciprocally? If they're going unilaterally, you actually want to fix that. You want to help them when you have time to go up and down the stairs, practicing that skill. What ends up happening is they go unilaterally for so long that using that other non-dominant leg creates a very scared feeling, and they just don't feel comfortable even holding on to a rail. These are things that is important for you to do. Removes a twist top cap, crosses midline naturally, follow safety commands, just the basics. Has a hand dominance. If you're noticing your child is switching back and forth to eat or to write or color, you're not naturally crossing that midline, okay? So like we talked about last week, if you're standing over here where this chair is, and you're handing me a snack, and I'm grabbing it with my non-dominant but close to you hand, that means that you're not naturally crossing midline in that brain. Like I said, it needs to go back and forth. That's the importance of going here and here. So if you're doing a puzzle with your child, put all the pieces on one side, okay? Hold that same arm down and have them do the whole puzzle on that side and then do with the opposite. So put all the pieces on the right side, hold that right arm down, and really having them reach across. That can be worked through in a day. It's not like a large thing that is hard to fix. It's just a thing that will cause a lot of issue, okay? Being able to fixate, like I said, practice looking at something for 10 seconds. You know, it's really important that they are able to focus for that amount of time. eye tracking in all planes and should be while standing. So basically when you're looking at your child and you're trying to see if their tracking is okay, you're 16 inches from the face, you're standing, and you're going back and forth, and they have to keep their head still. If they need a little assistance with their head, you can give them some at their chin level until they get that skill, okay? If they really can't do it, the easiest way is to lay down. The next easiest way is to sit up. So you go lay down, sit up, stand, okay? So you want them, before they go to kindergarten, to be able to do that, standing. Checking that strength, that egg position we talked about, laying on your back, holding your knees up, holding your head up. They should be able to do that for 10 seconds. On the floor, holding that Superman position up. They should be able to hold their arms and legs up for 10 seconds. These aren't things that we normally check, but this is a very good indication of where your child is on a global level, okay, if you've checked these things. Homework help. It's really important to create a routine after school. Personally, I find that if a child comes home from school and has homework, getting them a good-sized meal is important, but decreasing the amount of transitions. So if you say to them, if they say, I really don't want to do any more schoolwork, well, go play, but you're going to have to transition out of a preferred activity to a non-preferred activity. So personally, I think less transitions, the better. And basically what that means is they come home, they're having their snack, you're sitting with them, you can do their homework, and then they're free. That's less transitions, okay? You know, creating that visual. You complete this homework, you first do this, then you get this. Maybe it's their tech time. They need to earn that tech time. It should not be just given it to them. This is actually just a funny picture, this next one. Special education is not a place. When I was younger, it definitely was a room in our school. Now it's very more broad. It is being normalized. We are realizing that everybody has their own set of needs, accommodations, things like that. So when you're looking at this, it's a team of people that are there at the school that want to help you, but you need to engage with them as well and do your part, okay? So I'm going to bring out our special guest, Dr. Deanna Conley. I just want to say thank you guys so much for being here for the last couple weeks, and it's been my honor to be able to stand in front of you and give you information to help your child. Thank you.
Good evening. Good evening. Thank you, Sarah, for having me here. Tonight I'm going to be going over an overview of the special education process, everything from the referral all the way through that initial IEP and all the things that you might encounter in between. All right. Okay, so the first step of the special education process is that referral step. You may know or not know if your child has a disability. You might suspect something is off and you think they might need an IEP. The first thing you need to do is make a formal referral to the special education team. This must be in writing. I can't stress that enough. If you call your child's teacher and you say, you know, I think I'd really like to have the special ed team take a look at my kid, that is not a referral. They are in no obligation to follow that. But if you put something in writing in an email or go old school with a letter. You send that into the special ed department. You say, I suspect my child has a disability, or I know they have a documented disability, and I would like to have the special ed team take a look at them. Once that letter is received, that initiates the 10-day timeline. And they must hold a special education meeting within 10 days of receiving that letter. So please make sure you put everything in writing. At that referral meeting, everybody will come together and you will talk about how your child is performing. So they'll ask you to kind of start the meeting off and to say why you made the referral. Sometimes these referrals do come from teachers as well. For some reason, I find in Rhode Island that happens less frequently as them coming from families. I don't know why that is, but sometimes you will hear that from the school. But if you're the one making the referral, they will ask you, tell us a little bit about why you made this referral and why we're here today. They will present data, some of the district data they may have gathered. The classroom teacher will talk about performance. And your job as a team is to look at two questions. Do we suspect a disability? And again, sometimes going in that your child already has a diagnosis, and sometimes you don't. And is that suspected disability or known disability having an educational impact? If the answer is yes to those two questions, then the team will recommend moving forward with testing. Then you'll work together as a team to determine what that testing looks like. So typically in an initial evaluation, you're going to get a full academic battery, depending on the age and the appropriateness of that. They will do a psychological evaluation, which will look at your child's cognitive skills. That will include their memory, their visual spatial skills, their fluid reasoning skills, their processing speed. They will do a classroom observation. The observation should occur in the child's area of need. This is actually a law. It's one of our regulations. So make sure that you specify that. So if your child is a superstar at math, but they're really struggling in reading, that observation should not happen during their math class, right? You want to capture a good picture of why we're here, why we have these concerns. So sometimes it helps to just give that reminder that that's where you hope the observation will take place. They will likely also do a social history report, which is where a social worker will reach out to your family and will get your whole child's history. The reason they do that is because we want to know the whole child, right? We want to understand all the factors that may have led up to this day, whether it was complications with pregnancy, did they have early intervention services, etc. And with that, you can tell them as much or as little as you want. You're not beholden to give away any private information you're not comfortable sharing. You can just decline to answer, but that is why they do that piece of the puzzle. Another part is occupational therapy, speech, physical therapy. All of those evaluations can be done as well if that is an area of need for your child. I recommend asking about this up front when you do your referral letter. A lot of the districts I work with, they like to do screenings before they agree to these related service evaluations. So just to keep things moving along and to not delay the process, sometimes it helps if you know speech or OT is a big issue for your kiddo. When you write your referral letter, you can just put right in there, I would like OT and speech to do a screening prior to the referral meeting and to bring that information to the referral meeting. That way you've achieved two goals. One, you have all the right players at the table, so you don't need two meetings. And two, they will tell you right then and there whether or not they think testing in those areas is appropriate. Sometimes it's an obvious situation and a screening isn't needed, but just to save yourself some time and some sanity, it can be good to get a step ahead of them and just cut them to the chase. When you have your evaluation plan determined as a team, they will ask you to sign consent for it. And this is an important date. That you sign this paper to consent for testing starts a 60-day timeline. So now they must do all the testing and hold the eligibility meeting within 60 days of the date of that signature. If at any time during that testing window you change your mind, you also have the right to revoke your consent. So just know that that is one of your options. The other part of that too is legally when you sign consent for testing, the school has 10 school days to begin testing. The reason that regulation is in place is so that we don't end up doing all of our testing a week before the meeting, right? So they should be picking your kiddo up within 10 days of that date that you signed it. That doesn't always happen, but that's what the regulations state. And they have to have everything completed, again, within 60 calendar days. Always, always, always request copies of every report that will be shared to be sent to you 2 to 3 days before a meeting. This is not a requirement in Rhode Island. In other states, it is a requirement. In our state, it is not, though there are some people working on getting that changed at the moment. But it's really essential. I find that most districts will do it as a courtesy if you ask. You know, when you get into these meetings, it can be intimidating. You've got a lot of people around a table, and they're all talking about sensitive topics and things that can be emotional, right? So you're juggling, taking all of that information in, holding onto your parent piece and that emotional piece, because this is your baby that they're talking about, while trying to think of what questions, you know. Having time to prepare yourself ahead of time is really critical to being an equal team member and participant in that discussion, because you can have time to digest these reports in the privacy of your home, to think them through, to process the information in them, and to come up with a list of questions that you might have for the team. It's hard to go in there and do that all at once, right? So if you can get these reports ahead of time, I definitely suggest requesting. I usually make that request at the referral meeting when we're signing consent, and then I gently go back, you know, a week or two before the eligibility meeting and say, hey, like, would love those reports. You know, if you could just start sending them to me, that would be great. And again, most districts I work with are more than happy to do that, and they recognize, you know, I recognize too that it might not be 3 days before. Sometimes it is 1 day. They might be, you know, overloaded, but as long as you have a little bit of prep time, I think it really helps you be a better participant in those meetings and more able to hear what's being shared and take it all in. When you come together, your next meeting with this team would be your eligibility meeting. And during that, you have a conversation about all the reports that were done, all of the data that came back, any new classroom data that may have come up. And the team has 3 questions that they need to answer. Is there a disability present? Which again, sometimes we know for sure because you already have a diagnosis. Sometimes we don't. School teams are able to make an educational classification. They cannot diagnose a child, and they will tell you this. Only a neuropsych or a doctor can make a diagnosis. With that said, please do know that school teams can make a classification. So that means maybe your child doesn't have a formal diagnosis yet, but the school team looks at all this data they've collected and they're like, hey, this child looks a lot like a kid with ADHD. We can go ahead and find them eligible under the classification of other health impairment. We are not diagnosing your child with ADHD, but we are classifying them under this disability category in order to receive special ed services. So just know that that is something legally they can do, even without the diagnosis. If for some reason they tell you you must have a diagnosis, ask them for an independent evaluation. That will speed up the process too, because if the school is asking for an evaluation from a neuropsych, again, we start to fall into the 60-day timelines when you sign consent for that versus being on a wait list for one of our private practices, which we know can be 3 to 6 months at this point. So they shouldn't ask you for that legally. If they do, no, your next step would be to say, great, let me know when the neuropsych will be contacting me that the district has hired to do that. The second question that team will look at, if they've determined there's a disability or a suspected disability, we have to say, does that disability have an educational impact for our kids? So that is a big term, right? We automatically kind of think right to academic piece, but keep in mind that educational impact is a bigger global piece of that puzzle. It's all of the things that impact a child's ability to successfully participate in school, and that can be social communication, it can be executive functioning skills, It can be task initiation and completion, right? All of like pragmatic language, social skills, and of course, reading, writing, math, all of that is impacted too. But it's a big picture. It's not just whether my child is getting A's and B's and meeting some of these benchmarks. So bringing awareness to the global educational impact is important in that discussion. Usually if we've said yes to the first two questions, the third question is typically answered pretty easily. Does the child need a specially designed curriculum? And this is essentially what special ed is, right? This is the Individual Education Plan, or the IEP. So if we're able to say, yes, this child has a disability, yes, we see the educational impact in school, and yes, we definitely need a specially designed curriculum in order to address it, then your child has been found eligible for special education services. The next step would be drafting their initial IEP. So from the day of eligibility, the school then has 15 school days to write that initial IEP. Just like with the reports, always ask for a draft of what they're proposing ahead of that IEP meeting. So you have some time to look through it, make sense of it. Does this sound like my kid? Does it meet all of their needs? This is only a proposed draft. The IEP has to be written as a team. So whatever they share with you, they make a framework in the interest of time ahead of time. They're not predetermining any information. It's just we don't have a lot of time for these meetings. So we'll create, a proposal of what we think would be a good plan, and then together as a team we come together and fine-tune that. So just make sure that you go through that ahead of time so that you can have some input, right? Like you can come to the table and say, I don't think this goal matches the need exactly. I think we should change it to this. You are an equal member of that team, and your input does matter. So it helps to have it ahead of time. Children can qualify for an IEP anywhere from ages 3 all the way to when they're 22, when they would exit that system. So that's sort of the IEP process, and I'll get into the IEP piece a little more in a minute. But it is reviewed annually, and the eligibility process is reviewed every 3 years. So you can be found eligible, and then in 3 years you'll have what's called your triennial review, where they may go through this whole thing again and do new testing and redetermine if your child's eligible. The reason that is in place, it's really a safeguard to make sure that kids don't inappropriately remain in special ed if they are ready to exit, if they've met their goals. But that IEP you write to begin with, that does get reviewed every year. And I will tell you, in Rhode Island, the initial IEP is the only one that you as parents consent to and sign. In other states, and again, this is something that some people are working on getting our regulations changed so they're more equitable. In other states, you would sign every IEP that you get whenever it's changed. But in the state of Rhode Island, you just sign that first one. So really make sure that's a good one, because that's where you hold a little bit of leverage. And then after that, your signature is not required when you do update it annually. So what if your child is not found eligible, right? So sometimes we go through, we make the referral, they do the testing, or sometimes they say, nope, we're not going to do the testing because we don't suspect there's educational impact right now, and they send you on your way. What happens then? There are still a lot of supports that the school can offer, even if your child doesn't qualify for testing or qualify for an IEP. There are still things that can be put into place to support them on the school-based level that you should know about and you should know to ask for. The first is intervention services, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the progress monitoring piece that goes with that, and there is a 504 plan option as well. So response to intervention, you may have heard this term, RTI for short. It was really born out of this idea of not inappropriately identifying children for special education. So they were finding that a lot of kiddos were over-identified for maybe a behavior problem that wasn't really a disability, things of that nature. So this was a safeguard that was put into place to make sure that the kids that were getting into special education were truly the ones that needed special education. So it puts the onus back on the school to prove that there is a true area of need and disability present, and it's not something that they're just failing to do on their end in terms of providing good, solid research-based curriculum, qualified teachers, that they're teaching everything correctly. So they have to really do their due diligence in proving to the state that, yes, this isn't about curriculum, it's not lack of exposure to educational opportunity, it's truly a need. So response to intervention has 3 tiers to it. Sometimes there is a 4-tier model, but this is the most common one. Tier 1 is just general education. That's the curriculum that everybody is getting. About 80% of your students, if you're a classroom teacher, should be in Tier 1, okay? And these numbers are important because if you look and only 50% of your kids are in Tier 1, that's a reflection that you're doing something wrong as the teacher, right? That means that you need to make a change to how you're teaching, because that many kids should not be not getting it. Tier 2 is what happens when we start to notice some kids are falling behind, right? Where there's there's a group of maybe about, 10%, 15% of kids that are not getting it. And they look at STAR testing data can be a big indicator for forming these intervention groups. That's that district-wide test. Different districts have different ones they use, but that's a common one around here. One thing to note that's important is the STAR test only looks at reading and math. So I see a lot of times kids with writing needs fall through the cracks because nobody's flagging them for intervention because there's no STAR test for writing. So if you suspect your kid is having trouble with writing, start asking some questions. Ask for writing samples that have a rubric score attached to them. And see, hey, is this where you would expect my kid to be at this point in the year? And if not, what are we going to do? So that's something to really be cognizant about and to pay attention to. If your child qualifies for Tier 2, that means they are getting another layer of support, typically within the general ed classroom. It's very seamlessly done. It might mean that, if your kid is having trouble with comprehension, their classroom teacher pulls them for 2 extra reading groups, throughout the week. So it's blended right into the general ed classroom, but it is purposeful and it is happening, and they are being taught the content in a different way, and they're being taught it again. If your child qualifies for Tier 2, you should get a letter saying, your child is getting intervention. This is what the intervention looks like. Always, if you get that letter, ask the school to see the plan. Internally, they are writing RTI plans. They do not hold a meeting with every family when they create an RTI plan because that really wouldn't be feasible, but there are actual written plans for your child that exist that include a baseline. They include measurable data, a measurable goal, how the progress will be monitored. There should be a list of what accommodations are taking place just for your child in the classroom, and when progress will be looked at. So sometimes it's weekly progress updates, sometimes it's bi-weekly. So ask to see a copy of that plan. You can also ask to meet with the RTI team if you're so inclined. Definitely follow the timeline though, because at the end of typically 6 weeks, sometimes it's 6 to 8 weeks, but the average is 6, that RTI team will come back together and they will look at all of your child's data points for that 6-week period. If they look and see that, they're trending upwards and they're going to close that gap and be back on benchmark, then that's good news, right? They're probably going to exit your kiddo back to Tier 1, which is the goal. Kids can move in and out of Tier 1 and Tier 2 throughout a year. It's very common. But they're tracking that data to see, are we closing that gap and getting the kid back to benchmark? If that's the case, great. We're back to Tier 1. All's well that ends well. That's great. However, there's usually about 5% of kids from a class that aren't responding to Tier 2, right? So they're looking at their data points, and it's not that nice upward line. It might be straight, it might be up and down, or it might be trending in the opposite direction. So that's an indicator to the team, this is not enough. We're going to take it up a level. And that's where you get your Tier 3 support. Your Tier 3 support is more intensive. It's typically happening outside of the classroom. Now we're bringing in specialists. They might meet with a reading specialist twice a week for 30 minutes in a small group or one-on-one, or a math specialist. Also, I should mention, you can have an RTI goal in anything. It's not just academics. You could have one for your social skills. You could have one for your organizational skills. You can have one for your work completion. You can have one for occupational therapy. So anywhere there's a need, you can have an intervention plan. And if there is a need and your child's not on an IEP, you should ask for this. Sometimes when a child is on an IEP, they can still get intervention support, right? One doesn't X out the other. So depending, if they don't have a math goal yet, but you suspect something's off, let's get them an intervention group for math and see how that works. If they don't respond, then maybe we add a math goal to the IEP. So both can coexist. Your Tier 3 children, again, go through that same process. Now they have either the same goal or a new goal. They're getting more intensive services. That data is still being tracked, and this is the progress monitoring part. Always ask to see their data points. So if they are testing your child every week to see if they've, gotten their words per minute read higher or faster, ask to see all of that data and all of those points. The reason this is important is if they are not responding, right? If even with the highest level of support, they're not closing that gap and they don't have an upward trend in their numbers, and you were denied an IEP, that's your data you can bring back and make a second referral to the special ed team, right? So your kid's getting help. In the meantime, they're not being left, out in the cold. And at the same time, you're collecting data. So best case scenario, they do respond to the intervention. They're back with Tier 1, and that's great news. Worst case is they continue to not be successful, and now you have data to bring back to the special ed team and be like, here's the educational impact, here's the justification for specialized curriculum. So that's why knowing about this process, knowing that it exists, knowing what to ask for and what to see is going to be really important for you if you're advocating for your child to get more support at school. Next slide. The other option sometimes is the 504 route, okay? So sometimes we have children that have a clear disability, there's definitely an educational impact, but they don't need a specialized curriculum. There's not anything differently that we would teach them, but they just really need accommodations. And sometimes you can have a kid who has a 504 with an intervention plan, right? So they are still getting different levels of support within the building. It just looks a little different than an IEP. So a 504 can be an appropriate route to go if your child doesn't qualify for special ed. A 504 is a general education document. It is not special education. And it doesn't have direct services, right? So whereas with an IEP, you're gonna have goals, you'll have service time, you'll have service delivery, you might have related services like OT and PT. A 504 plan does not have that. It just is a list of accommodations. And you can, though, one thing that's important is you can ask for consultations from those related service staff. So if your child has occupational therapy needs, you can ask for an OT consult as one of the accommodations in a 504 plan. That is not direct service. The OT will never work directly with your child, but what they'll do is they'll have built-in time to talk with your child's teachers and to say, like, hey, let's give this kiddo a wiggle cushion, let's give them a fidget, here's a special pencil grip or a slant board that might help. So just know that you can get really creative with 504 plans, and you can really beef them up and make them as comprehensive as possible to support all of your child's needs, even without that direct service. These accommodations with an IEP and with a 504, and I'll say this again at the end, they apply to every setting in a school building. It is not just your 4th grade teacher. It is the art teacher, the PE teacher, the music teacher. You know, if they're in middle and high school, it's every teacher. Biology, history, they all have to follow the 504 or the IEP. Both of these are legal documents. The IEP is under the special education umbrella. The 504 is under the general education umbrella. But they're still legal documents. They still need to be followed. A 504 doesn't come with a case manager. So when you have an IEP, you do have a special educator that's assigned to your child, and their job is to deliver the services in the IEP, check in with the child's, general ed teachers, make sure everything's going well. A 504, usually you have a 504 coordinator in the building. It might be the principal, it might be a guidance counselor. So you kind of have to take on that role as case manager. And it does mean, which sometimes you have to do with an IEP as well, but it does mean, prepare yourself to email the teachers at the start of the year. Either way, my child has this document, please follow it. I will be watching, whatever you nicely need to say. It is also reviewed annually, just like the IEP. And both of them are very fluid documents, so if any point in time you need to make a change, you can make changes to either document as needed. All right, I'm going to go and talk about some of the common disability categories. So when we're looking at eligibility and we're going through that referral process, there are 13 disability categories that your child could be found eligible for, but these are the ones that we see the most often. So I'm just going to highlight these 4 quickly. In Rhode Island, we just pick one category when we're finding a child eligible for services. It's just a census reporting, data reporting reason. There's no special reason other than how we report the information out to the state. So we have to pick, your child might have ADHD and autism and anxiety, but we have to pick which of those is the most impactful in the classroom setting. That becomes your child's primary disability category. But that doesn't mean that that's the only area of focus in the IEP. The IEP has to service all of your child's needs, regardless of which category the team picked. So this is more for reporting information, and it helps us determine where the biggest impact is, but it won't, take away any services that your child gets because of what we select as a team. Specific learning disability is one that comes up a lot, as you probably know. That is a processing difficulty. So that means your child probably must have average to above average IQ. They're very bright kids, which means they often are also very good at hiding this in the classroom setting. They're good at masking some of their difficulties because we all want to fit in, right? But they're having difficulty with either how information is getting into their brains, how they are manipulating it and processing it in their brains, or how they're outputting it. They could have trouble with all 3 of those steps, or 1 of the 3, or 2 of the 3, but it's a processing difficulty, and we see commonly dyslexia, dysgraphia with writing, dyscalculia with math, auditory and visual processing, nonverbal learning disabilities are all part of that learning disability category. An auditory or a visual processing disability does not mean that your child has trouble with hearing or seeing. They can hear fine. You might question it sometimes. They can see fine, but their brain is processing visual information differently. Their brain is processing auditory information differently than you are or their peers might be. The other is autism spectrum disorder, and again, some common things we see are the communication difficulties, trouble with social skills, that pragmatic language, difficulty being flexible, so seeing that rigidity, problems with staying organized. Sometimes you see that repetitive stimming behavior, which can really be a great calming tool for children on the spectrum. It is a spectrum, which means that children can be high and low functioning in every different area. It's very individualized to the child, right? So some kids might be just good with their communication part, but their organization skills and their social skills are really weak. right? So it just really depends on the child, and each of their individual profiles will look a little bit different. Other health impairment is what we use for ADHD. That's sort of the umbrella disability category that we often put into ADHD. It can also be a health condition like asthma, cardiac problems, diabetes, epilepsy. Any of those medical conditions fall under other health impairment. And to qualify for that, you have to show that there is difficulty with strength, vitality, and or alertness. You don't have to have all three, but one of the three has to be happening. So difficulty with that stamina, throughout a day, focus, attention. The last category that we see most often is that emotional disturbance category. And to qualify for that, the difficulty a child's having cannot be related to intelligence or health. Those factors cannot be part of the puzzle. So it's a child that's having trouble over an extended period of time, so it's not incidental. This is a long pattern of behavior across settings, and it involves having trouble with relationships, maybe depression, unhappiness, being withdrawn, those somatic behaviors with like the physical symptoms, like the child who always has the bellyache or the headache, but there's no physical, issue with them. They might have inappropriate fears or reactions to a normal circumstance. So, if there's a disaster or, your pet passes away, we all have a natural, normal response to that. These are the children that are having that response every day for no, known cause. And some of the things that fall under that is anxiety, OCD, bipolar, eating disorders, conduct disorders, things of that nature can all fall under that emotional disturbance category. So those are the 4 big ones that I tend to see most often with IEP teams. But again, there are 13 categories that could fit the bill. So the IEP. How do you write a good IEP? This is really important. A good IEP should really weave together, and each piece of it should connect in, like you're, tying a string. They should all interconnect and they should all make sense collectively. The first thing you need to look at, and this is really important, the first page is your present levels of performance. This will outline all of your child's strengths and needs in every area. So executive functioning, communication if needed, math, reading, writing, every area that, is part of their puzzle. Anything that is listed as a need has to be a goal. I'm going to say that again because it's important. Anything that is listed as a need in the present levels that string should tie to a goal, right? This is important because if you really want a goal for your child in a certain area, make sure it's listed as a need, right? Or sometimes you see needs listed and then you get to the goals page and you're like, they mentioned that my child is having trouble with math problem solving, but there's no math problem solving goal. So when you get to that IEP meeting to ask that question, shouldn't there be a goal for this? Because it says right here it's a need. Okay, so that's important. Your goals and objectives are then based off of those needs. When we're writing these goals, we're talking about where will my child be 1 year from today. So when I say these are reviewed annually, I don't mean they're reviewed every September when the new school year starts. It's whatever your date is for your first IEP. So if you had an IEP in March, we're talking about where do we expect our child to be next year at this time in March. So you're writing those goals according to a year's worth of growth, and the objectives are those incremental steps that we'll take to get there. Again, this is where it's really important. Every time you get a report card, you will get a progress update on these IEP goals with your report card. Read those, ask questions about those, look to see, did they meet all of their objectives they should have met by this time of year? If not, that's your data to bring back to a team to say, I think my child might need more service time, right? Or a different setting for the service to take place. You can't ask for a change without good data. So that's how you get good data, is by watching that progress monitoring, looking at those progress updates that you get home, making sure that they're on track. And it's okay to ask a case manager to write them again. Sometimes case managers write, doing so great, awesome, but by November they were supposed to be writing a 2-paragraph essay earning a score of 3 out of 4 on the rubric. What's my child's rubric score and how many paragraphs can they currently write? Ask that their progress updates reflect the actual objective that your child is on, so that you can have measurable data to make sure that they are on track to meet their goal and to know what to do if they're not. The service time is then, how do we meet the goals, right? How much time is it going to take to meet the goal, and where is the service going to take place? Obviously, we always start with the least restrictive environment, especially if it's a new IEP. We want to keep children with their general ed peers as much as possible, but starting with that and tracking that progress through the progress updates is important. If they're meeting their objectives and it's all in-class service, great, that's awesome. But if you're finding that that's not the case, you can call an IEP meeting at any time. You don't have to wait for the annual review. This is a fluid document. It can always be updated, it can always be changed, and you can always say, yeah, I agreed to start with 30 minutes 3 times a week in class, but I don't think my child is meeting their goal. I have these progress updates and they're not on track. I think we need more. Or we need pull-out, whatever the case might be. Or they're doing really great, they're ahead of schedule, let's pull back, right? And then that final piece of that thread is the accommodations. This is, what do we need to do on the classroom level to just make learning accessible? So this is your ramp, right? My kid's having trouble getting up the stairs, this is my ramp so that I can access the curriculum that's being taught. You're not giving them extra. They're not getting, any added benefits above everybody else. This is not special treatment. You are just leveling the playing field with accommodations. And accommodations are so critical because that is exactly what it does. It levels the playing field and it makes learning accessible to students, right? It's giving them that ramp to learning so that they can enter at the same point as their peers in that room. And you know a kid when they're not getting their accommodations. You can tell right away. Usually their demeanor changes, they're not feeling successful. It's pretty evident because those are really critical tools for them to be able to learn along with their peers. And again, everyone in the building legally must follow them. As I mentioned before, the only IEP that you sign is the initial one. In Rhode Island, after you have your meeting, you have 10 days before the IEP goes into effect. And in those 10 days, you can make changes. Always, always, always look at the IEP that they send back to you with the changes in there. I would say 9 out of 10 times, maybe 10 out of 10, I look through IEPs where all the edits were made and there are changes missing. Almost always. It's very rare that that doesn't happen, and I do a lot of this every day. So go through it. Make a list of every change that you agreed to as a team and check were all of those changes actually made. Usually it's just little errors and you can go back to the case manager, we said we were going to do extended time, I don't see that listed, can you add that in? And they will happily add it in and you're on your way and that's great. You also have the right to waive those 10 days if you want the IEP to go right into play immediately, but I recommend taking the time to go through and make sure that all changes were made as discussed, because oftentimes, just human error, that's not the case. So I'm just going to end with a few helpful hints, some of which I've already touched on, but we'll just reiterate. Again, you have to select one disability category, but every need of your child will be met. You only consent to that initial IEP for that implementation of services. After that, it's just a matter of negotiating during that 10-day period. But again, if the 10 days passed and you want another change met, just call a meeting. You can call as many meetings as you want or may not want. Again, I've said this a few times, but it really is important whether you have a 504 or an IEP, every teacher is legally accountable for making sure those accommodations are in place because that is your child's ramp. It's essential for them to be able to succeed. You can have a disability and not be found eligible. A lot of times there's a misconception if your child has a diagnosis that they automatically will get an IEP. That's not always the case, unfortunately, because again, the schools are held to the state and federal regulations where there has to be an educational impact and there has to be the need for a specially designed curriculum. So sometimes we have a child who might have autism, but we're not seeing the impact in the school building. And that can be really hard and really frustrating for families, but unfortunately that can be the case. And that's where you want to say, okay, well, what intervention supports can you give them? Like, would we qualify for a 504? Like, always be sure to ask, well, what else can we get, right? How do we get creative? That door to special education is always open. You can always, if you were denied services, you can always come back to the table, and that's why keeping track of all the data that the school is collecting, district data, intervention data, is really critical. Or if you do your own testing and gather more data and you want to bring that back, you can always make another referral at any time. And you can request a meeting at any time. I do recommend if you are new to the special education process and world to get yourself a giant 3-ring binder and to start organizing because the paperwork is really something. So, make a section for IEPs, a section for testing, a section for, your meeting minutes, prior written notice, which I'll talk about next, email correspondences that are important, data points, all those IEP updates coming home, report cards. Get a system because it does get to be helpful. You can bring that with you to meetings and you have all of your talking points right there in front of you. You always want to ask for copies of your meeting minutes. They typically will not give them to you unless you ask. And your prior written notice is a really essential document. That's your only legal representation of what was discussed. It's okay to ask them to read the prior written notice to you and review it with you as a team before you leave the meeting. Most of the time, you just get it sent to you after the meeting. But if it's a contentious meeting or there are things you disagree on, it's smart to ask them to present the PWN to the team because then you could ask, I would actually like this added that mom did not agree with this decision, or dad requested extra service time and the school denied it. That way you have it documented. If it happens after the fact, you get the prior written notice and you go back and say, oh, I would like that changed. I've never seen a district agree to change it. They just say, oh, well, we'll just attach your email to it. So an email's not legal though, right? So always ask for your PWN. Don't be afraid to ask them to review it with you or the meeting minutes with you as a team. Some districts do that. And keep copies of everything because that is your only legal record of what occurred at that meeting. And then finally, the most important thing in the world of special ed, what I started with, put everything in writing. Nothing exists unless it's in writing. Starting with that first referral to the special ed team, maybe you write an email to the special ed director or to your case manager and you ask some big questions. And surprise, surprise, they call you up, which is great. And they give you all your answers over the phone. That's because they don't want to put it in writing, right? That's not an accident that they're calling you. So what do? You have your nice conversation, take notes, and then right when you hang up that phone, you email the school, you email that person. Thank you so much for calling with me today. I'm so glad that we agreed to continue intervention services in math and reconvene the team in 1, month. I look forward to meeting with you then. So document everything that had just been said. And now you have it in writing, print it, put it in your binder, and you're done. So that's my overview of the special education process from referral all the way through to that IEP process. I hope it was helpful. Thank you again, Sarah, for having me here. It was lovely to be included in this great event, and I'll hang around a little bit after if anyone has any questions that I can answer. And that's it.